Buongiorno. Good morning to all of my friends at SHR Italia and We Legal. It's always nice to be in Italy, even if it's virtual. I'm going to start on a rather somber note here. I hope it'll end up being a liberating reflection as it relates to the future of employment in industry. The fact is that GDP has been growing at a slower rate all over the world for the last 10 or 15 years. No surprise. The reason that's happening is productivity has been declining across the planet over the last 2 decades. And the result is we have a lot of structural unemployment, especially a problem for the young Gen Z and millennial generation trying to find a secure place in a 21st century workforce. And our economists are projecting 20 more years of low productivity and slow growth. And let me do the numbers for you. After 2 industrial revolutions in the 19th and 20th century, here's where we stand this morning. Arguably half the human race, most of us in the western part of the planet, are far better off and more affluent than our ancestors were before we began this experiment called the Industrial Revolution. I think it's also fair to say, however, that 43% of the human race living on $5 a day or less, which is the poverty level, are at best marginally better, but perhaps no better off than we began the industrial age. So while half the human race has done well, the other half of the human race has not. The very rich have done very well. This morning, as I talk to you, the 8 richest individuals on the planet, 8 human beings, the 8 richest individuals on the planet today, their combined wealth now equals the accumulated wealth of 1/2 the human beings living on Earth. That's over 3.5 billion people. There's something very wrong with the way our human family is organizing our economic relationships in the 21st century. But now we have a more profound crisis, and it goes to the heart of the future of business and employment. We are now in real-time climate change, no longer theory. It's right now at our front door. I don't have to remind you in Italy. We are seeing in real time the impacts that global warming is having on the world. Let me explain what global warming does. It's essential. If we know what it's all about, we would all be justifiably alarmed and committed to one task, and that is to employ the human race in finding ways to adapt to and be resilient in a new climate-changing world. Global warming changes the hydrological cycle of the Earth. That's what this is all about. So we have been spewing massive amounts of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere to create this industrial way of life. And as a result, those global warming gases are not letting the sun's heat come back off of the Earth. So for every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature goes up from global warming gases, the atmosphere is actually sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat is forcing precipitation more quickly into the clouds. So we're getting more dramatic precipitation and more concentrated precipitation in the clouds and more extreme, uncontrollable, exponential water events. So what's happening now is that the hydrological cycle, the water cycle is rewilding itself. And it's dramatically changing the way we live on this planet. So I would like every young person in this audience and every parent and grandparent to hear this. Our scientists now tell us we are in the 6th extinction event of life on Earth. Doesn't even make the headlines. We've had 5 mass extinctions on this planet well before humans were ever here. When they came quick, massive die-out of life, 10 million years or so to get new life on this planet. We're now in the 6th extinction event. And our scientists are telling us that we could see the elimination of nearly half of all the species living on this little planet in the lifetime of today's children. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. We need to wake up. And the reason I mention this affects how we begin to rethink our approach to economic life, the kind of employment that'll be required in a climate-changing world, and how we will begin to rethink the relationship between society and the natural world that we live in. So let me back up for a moment. We need to ask the big question. How do the great economic paradigm shifts in history occur? If we know how they occur, we're going to get a roadmap and a compass that can allow us to rethink the notion of economic management and the kinds of employment we will need in a world that's moving to an extinction event. There have been at least 7 major economic paradigm shifts in history. They're all very interesting. They share a same common denominator. And that is, at a moment of time across a society, 3 technologies emerge and converge to create an infrastructure that fundamentally changes the way we communicate, power, and move our economic life, our social life, and our governance. What are those 3 technology revolutions that come together? 1, new sources of communication. 2, new modes of energy. 3, new forms of mobility and transportation and logistics. So when new communication revolutions converge with new energy regimes and new sources of mobility and logistics, it actually changes the way we communicate power and move life. It allows larger numbers of people to come together in more differentiated skills across an infrastructure so that we can begin to, as a social organism, establish new ways of living. I'll give you 2 quick examples. First industrial revolution, Britain in the 19th century. Second industrial revolution in the 20th century. So the Brits come up with a communication revolution called steam-powered printing. No more manual print presses. Big leap forward in productivity. And then the Brits lay out a telegraph system, instant communication, across the British Isles in the last half of the 19th century. Those 2 communication revolutions converged with a new energy regime. We went from wood as energy to coal. And then we took the steam engine that we used with coal and we put it on tracks for railroads, transportation. So the coming together of these 3 important categories, communication, energy, mobility, and logistics, took us from regional markets to national markets. It took us from empires to national states, nation states. It took us to dense urban areas. The railroads could go city to city. So it changed everything, and it changed the nature of employment dramatically. This is the beginning of mass employment in industry and the emergence of capitalism. In the 20th century, the second industrial revolution in the United States. Here, the communication revolution was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell gave us the telephone, and we wired up the country. The new energy regime was cheap Texas oil. We didn't need coal anymore. And then finally, the new mobility and logistics was Henry Ford, put us in the Model T Ford automobile. First, we had internal combustion transport on road, then rail, then water, then air corridors. This second industrial revolution gave us new types of employment. We needed a massive industrial workforce, and we needed giant vertically integrated corporations to get economies of scale and return revenue to investors. To train these workforces, we needed a new thing called public universities. So the first industrial revolution began this change into an industrial workforce in the 19th century in Britain, but the second industrial revolution, which started in the US and moved around the world, moved to mass labor in industry and society. This second industrial revolution took us from dense urban environments to suburban environments. It took us from national markets to global markets and globalization. And again, it created workforces across continents that would begin to engage in exports and import and trade across an entire planet. That second industrial revolution took the world through the 20th century, and it peaked in July 2008. Now, many of you in this room today will remember that month, because on that month, the price of Brent crude oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets, and the entire global economy shut down. That was the greater economic earthquake of the second industrial revolution. The collapse of the financial markets 60 days later was an aftershock, because that was just about subprime mortgages and a Ponzi scheme. Why was the 147 a barrel oil the earthquake? Everything relies on fossil fuels in this civilization. It's not just the gasoline for our automobiles, our food preservatives and additives, our pharmaceutical products, our packaging materials, our construction materials, our power, heat, transport, light. It's all either made out of or moved by fossil fuels. So when the price of fossil fuels goes over $75, $80 a barrel, all the other prices go up, inflation. And when oil hits over 100 a barrel, the entire economy shuts down. And that's what's happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The price of oil has shot up, and because of that, inflation is increasing. It's affecting employment dramatically, and we are moving toward a possible new recession in the coming year. The good news is this is probably the last of the fossil fuel wars, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it's taking us into a third industrial revolution. So let me explain where we're at. It's clear that the second industrial revolution and all the kinds of employment we used in heavy industries and giant global corporations is sunsetting. But a third industrial revolution is emerging with a new communication, energy, and mobility infrastructure. Let me step back and share an anecdote. When Angela Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, she invited me to Berlin in the first few weeks of her new government to help her address the question of how do we create jobs in Germany and new kinds of businesses. And when I got to Germany, the first question I asked the Chancellor is, Madam Chancellor, how do you create new jobs and new businesses when your industries are plugged into a second industrial revolution infrastructure of centralized communication, fossil fuel, nuclear energy, internal combustion, transport, and logistics, and that infrastructure to communicate, power, and move the society and create the new business opportunities and jobs, that infrastructure actually peaked in its aggregate efficiency, the ratio of useful to potential work. It peaked in every industrial country over the last 20 years. And so I said, you can have market reform, fiscal reform, new kinds of smart businesses, new ways of approaching employment, but it won't make any difference if your industries are plugged into a dying second industrial revolution infrastructure of the 20th century, and with it, the kinds of businesses and employment that went with it. That's the nub of the problem. So on that first day with the Chancellor, we talked about a third industrial revolution. We were already beginning to put this in place in Europe. I advised the last three presidents of the European Commission, including your Romano Prodi, as a friend of mine, and the current Commission. And here's what we have come up with over the last many years that's operational. The third industrial revolution infrastructure, the communication revolution, the internet. We have 4.5 billion people now connected all over the world, and they have in the palm of their hands a smartphone with more computing power in their hand than sent our astronauts to the moon. That is a huge shift, and it brings billions of people into the possibility of communicating with each other at low fixed cost and near zero marginal cost. Now that communication revolution, the internet, is now converging with a second internet, an electricity internet made up of solar and wind electricity. The fact is that millions and soon hundreds of millions and soon several billion of our fellow human beings will be producing their own solar and wind where they live, where they work, in the communities they reside. The sun shines everywhere. The wind blows everywhere, but it's intermittent. So it means that when there's sun in one part of the world, we've got to be able to take the solar and wind there and move it across high voltage direct current lines across continents, underground cable across oceans, and share that sun across time zones with the rotation of the planet. Same with the wind. Everything I'm telling you is happening right now in real time. So we are increasingly seeing millions and pretty soon hundreds of millions and more people employed, if you will, just by being a homeowner or living in a community or working for a small business to generate their own solar and wind, and what they're not using, send it up on an increasingly digitized electricity internet using the same big data analytics and algorithms to share solar and wind electricity around the world as we use big data and analytics and algorithms to share communication, news, and knowledge on the communication internet. They're converging, creating all sorts of new potential employment and new jobs, new types of businesses. Those two internets are now converging with a third internet, a digitized mobility and logistics internet made up of electric and hydrogen fuel cell transport powered by solar and wind electricity from the electricity internet. And again, this mobility internet will be using big data and analytics and algorithms to manage autonomous vehicles, road, rail, water, and maybe air, using that big data, just like we use that big data and analytics to share news, knowledge, and entertainment on the communication internet, and share now solar and wind around countries and soon around the world on the electricity internet. These three internets create a new infrastructure, a third industrial revolution infrastructure, and the new businesses and employment that go with them. It also takes us from globalization of our economy to glocalization. Because now with these three internets, anyone very cheaply can set up a small or medium-sized enterprise, high-tech, state-of-the-art, and create fluid platforms with other small and medium-sized enterprises in cooperatives, and began to share business opportunities with each other all over the world and bypass some of those big global corporations that really control most of the game in the 20th century. Let me explain what I mean. And I work with global Fortune 500 companies. Many of them went through my seminars at the Wharton School in their advanced preparation. But what's interesting about these global companies, they needed to, because the first and second industrial revolution infrastructures were so expensive, no monarchy or rich family could afford to lay out these infrastructures. So we created a shareholding corporation. So we get lots of shareholders to actually invest. And these first and second industrial revolutions infrastructures had to vertically integrate to create economies of scale and return investment to their shareholders. This happened in both socialist and capitalist countries across every industry. So here's what's interesting. At the end of the line, with the second industrial revolution now dwindling, we have 500 global corporations in the world, Fortune 500, 500 companies, 500 CEOs. And their combined assets equal 1/3 of the GDP of the entire global community. And what's more interesting, these 500 companies that are 1/3 of the GDP of the world, you know how many workers they have? Their total workforce is only 65 million people out of a workforce of 3.5 billion human beings. So if we want to understand why there's a disconnect between the very rich and even the well-off and much of the human race that is in the poverty level without employment and others marginally employed, it's the nature of the system. It happens whether you're in a capitalist or socialist economy. It's the nature of the infrastructure. What's interesting about this third industrial revolution infrastructure is it portends a great democratization of commerce. You got a smartphone, producing your own solar and wind. You have backup batteries and hydrogen fuel cell right where you work or live in your neighborhoods. And you can begin then to create these flat businesses where you have lateral economies of scale. Small amounts of investments. You don't have to spend a lot of money in globalization, and you can create your SMEs in cooperatives, and you can engage all over the planet. I'll give you an example. You can have a small SME in a cooperative somewhere in Italy, and let's say that you are doing software to print out homes, which they're already doing, where you use 3D printing, fabricated printing, and you can actually use a base like soil. And then the printer can actually print out, if you will, an entire building in 200 hours or even less, 100 hours or less, a whole building. But if you're a smart SME, you would have the actual program you've developed to print out that building. And this is happening right now. All of this is in the market. And then you can sell or share or loan that printed workwear to someone thousands of miles away on another continent, and they can print out the building. So they could print out any kind of product line. They could print out parts of their machinery and technology. So you can begin to share virtually the instructions, and then by doing that, you don't have to then send all that equipment across oceans. So we can see a potential of a vast democratization of life, economic life. It means a huge numbers of more agile SMEs and cooperatives made up of employment that's local but global, not global, local but global. And that employment can begin in cooperatives to manage economic activity across the world in a globalized world. So that's the upside. I would say that the downside of this third industrial revolution infrastructure is we need to worry about the dark net. How do we ensure that governments don't purloin this dark net and then interfere in the affairs of other governments? That's already happening. How do we ensure everyone has open access to this global brain and nervous system with satellite communication and everybody with smartphones? How do we ensure everyone has access and no one's denied? How do we ensure that against cyber attacks and cyber terrorism, or that global internet companies don't purloin all our data and we become, if you will, a workforce without being paid? So even though there's a dark side to this, we have to deal with that. I work with the leadership in the European Union and the People's Republic of China and in the United States. We have to address these issues, but let's assume we can address the dark side. Let's say that you are a local business in Italy, a cooperative, and maybe you're working with a large global company. A lot of these global companies will not disappear, but they will be in alignment with SMEs in a localized platform rather than the old-fashioned markets. So you can already, if you're a small business or a medium-sized enterprise or even a large company in Italy, you can go up on this emerging Internet of Things platform, and you can get a pretty transparent picture of a lot of free data going across the system. And then you can mine that big data with your own analytics and algorithms. And then you can use that data to aggregately increase your efficiencies, reduce your fixed and marginal costs across your entire value chain, reduce your carbon footprint. And therefore, you can begin to experience a return on investment, but you won't be caught or trapped in a larger, if you will, globalized frame. It's more localized. So there's a huge opportunity here for democratizing commerce and trade. I want to turn my attention to the employment. We have to understand that the first and second industrial revolutions, their temporal and spatial orientation was quite different than what we need for the third industrial revolution. We always talk about efficiency in business. How do we become more efficient? We never question it. It's the temporal value of the first and second industrial revolutions, but it won't be in the third. The reason is this: efficiency is how each of us, and in our businesses and communities, can extract more and more of the natural world in bigger hunks, commodify it, propertize it, consume it, and disregard it in shorter time intervals. That's efficiency. But what's happened is by using this time value, we've depleted the earth. We've undermined the hydrosphere, our waters that run across the planet. We have destroyed our forest and soil in the lithosphere. We have bludgeoned the atmosphere with global warming gases. So what's happening now is there's a beginning of a rethink, even in the business schools and in government, saying, and it happened when the COVID-19 epidemic started, and you remember we couldn't get the ventilators or the masks or the medical equipment or even the toilet paper. And what they realized is that we became hyper efficient by reducing redundancy. So when COVID hit and when climate disasters are now hitting, we don't have backup. In nature, it doesn't work in terms of efficiency. It works in terms of adaptivity. So every species is continually adapting to changes in the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere, adapting every stage of those changes. Because the real agencies that run this planet, the real capital, is the hydrosphere, the waters, the lithosphere, the soil and the forest, and our animal life, the atmosphere, the oxygen. The biosphere is all of that. So what happens here is that we've become more efficient, but we've depleted the earth. What we're beginning to realize in the business community is that we need to have another time value, and that's adaptivity. And that is constantly being able to use our time to adapt to climate change, to find new ways to steward our relationship to the various agencies of the planet that we live in. This is crucial. So you're hearing more and more discussion in the business community, in the business schools, and in global companies on shifting the time value from efficiency to adaptivity, because in nature, you need redundancy. You can't just have a lean production line in nature where you only have one crop or one animal or one type of tree, because then if something happens, the whole system breaks down. So in nature, it's based on redundancy, on having lots of different options so that the systems can recalibrate if they have crises. So now the discussion beginning in companies that I work with around the world is how do we move from efficiency as our time value to adaptivity? We're going to have to do that. That's the only way we'll be able to replenish the earth. So what's happening now is a basic change in the way we work. So let me just share this with all of you about employment. The third industrial revolution infrastructure, agile, local, involves employment working together all over the world. It moves us from productivity to regenerativity. We are moving from growth to flourishing. We are moving from markets to networks. We're moving from sellers and buyers to providers and users. We're moving from externalities to circularity. We're moving from GDP to quality of life indicators. We're moving from geopolitics to biosphere cooperation. These are heavy changes, and they bring us into a new era, what we call the age of resilience. It's becoming increasingly clear to us in the business community that the age of progress is over. I don't think anyone seriously thinks that we are still in an escalating age of progress where we spend most of our time extracting the planet, using it up, discarding it, and now in an extinction event. The age of resilience is now ascendant. And in the age of resilience, we have to begin to take care of our ecosystems. We have to prepare for a climate change world. That's the new businesses and jobs. The fact is that what's going on now is even if we reduce our global warming emissions, the temperature on the planet is continuing to change. We are not going back to the good old days. How do we adapt to a world with a runaway water cycle, forest and soil that have to be replenished, an atmosphere that has to be cleansed? How do we address climate disasters every day? The new employment will be in disaster relief. It'll be in creating more resilient infrastructure. It will be in eco services where we prepare generations to steward our real capital, which is our ecosystems. It's going to change the entire nature of employment fundamentally. And it's going to also mean we have to rethink education. The old education model does not prepare us for a climate world. If we're shifting to adaptivity, we have to have a very sound understanding in our educational system of how the planet operates, how the systems and the ecosystems interact, how our businesses and our employment fits into that new type of job categories. So in education, I'll give you an example of what we're doing. Haute-France, that's the industrial region of France. I'm sure most of you know Haute-France, from Lille to Dunkirk. My global team has been there with them for the last decade. What we've done there is we've prepared them for this, and they've done it, most of it themselves, for this new era of the age of resilience. And what's interesting about this is the educational system. The 26 universities and the 250 high schools have come together in a coalition. The universities realize that we have to prepare workers who understand more than their little discipline. We don't want to just create an accountant or an engineer or a sociologist, because they know more about less. They know their own discipline, but they have no understanding of how it relates systemically to the larger world we live in and the ecosystems of this earth. So the universities have moved to what we call interdisciplinary learning for the workforce of the 21st century. That is, all of the disciplines are taught integratively, so that we see how each discipline has relationship and affects every other discipline. So we learn to think systemically, no more silos, break the academic walls, so that we prepare a workforce, whether it's semi-skilled, skilled, or professional, that can understand how to adapt to the complex relationships in the ecosystems that we're going to have to attend to as we move into the age of resilience. They're also moving toward learning that's based on team learning. So you not only have interdisciplinary studies to train the workforce, but you also have team learning where, say, 5 or 10 students get together in a team. They have to teach each other with the guidance of the professor, and they learn by cooperating in their education rather than competing. And they learn by each sharing the knowledge that they're engaged with. And then we're taking that learning and moving it into the community. It's called clinical education, where they share their interdisciplinary learning with the community they live in, and they get feedback from the community's knowledge. This is a completely different approach to education to prepare a workforce that's more systemic, more integrated, more aware of all the relationships that we have as families and workers and communities to the larger natural world to which we are a part, and which our fellow species are our fellow in this living planet. I would leave with this thought. Karl Marx would probably have never understood this, but the workers of the world are the major source of capital on this planet today, the workers. What's interesting is that the largest pool of capital in the world today is pension funds. Public employees, private employees, part of their deferred savings all over the world is invested on their behalf. Pension funds are worth $42 trillion. It's the largest pool of the world. So our workforce has to understand that they are also, if you will, the generators of capital. But we have to move that capital to the new infrastructure. And what's interesting now is that the pension funds have been the primary investors of moving out of a fossil fuel civilization. They've taken out trillions of dollars of money from the fossil fuel civilization because it's stranded assets. Solar and wind are now much cheaper. And they're investing those pension funds on behalf of their workers in the new third industrial revolution infrastructures, the solar and wind producing energies, the new electricity lines that are digital, the new transport and logistics that's electric and solar and wind generated. All of this, the new Internet of Things infrastructure for the buildings. So we have huge potential for the workforce in the 21st century. Number one, we're going to have to build resilient new infrastructure, homes, offices, businesses. Number two, we're going to have to move toward new cities, ephemeral cities, because some of the places we live are no longer livable. This requires new approaches by industry to be more agile and be able to assemble businesses and be willing to disassemble them quickly and reassemble them somewhere else. This means that we're going to have to prepare our citizens in each community to be the stewards during climate events. There is a huge reclamation effort at place. This is the biggest shift in workforces in the history of the planet. The Italian workforce already has an edge. You're very familiar with cooperatives. You also know how to create industries that operate on a global scale. And so my hope is that the workforce and the businesses of Italy will begin to take a careful look at this new age of resilience that's emerging, because this is where the new business opportunities will be. This is where we'll see a more democratization of economic life. This is where we will have new ways to prepare and train our workforce. And this is probably the place where we'll reduce the work week. Much of it will be virtual because of climate change. Some of it will be physical as we go back into the environment and steward it. At the same time, we'll probably end up with a 4-day work week or a 30-hour work week, because we're finding out by our medical community that peak productivity is about 4 hours a day. After that, productivity declines. So we're learning that it's better to engage aggressively at workplace, whether it's virtual or physical, with the parameters of smaller work week and shorter work days, and be more, if you will, able to attend to the problems at hand. So I hope this has been helpful. This is just the beginning. I have a new book that'll come out, The Age of Resilience, in Italy and around the world, in various languages, in November. I hope some of you have a chance to take a look at it. And I would hope that we can continue this conversation down the line. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking with you today. Thank you.